Right, everybody. So welcome to the session. And somebody's entered the waiting room. Let me admit. Hi, Robin. Ooh. There. So welcome to today's session. I'm Laura. I am the research assistant at the Devil's Porridge Museum, and I am kind of taking the lead on this project and taking the lead on this online historical research training session. And before I started at the Devil's Porridge Museum in January, I've just finished my PhD. So yeah, research and historical research is kind of my thing. I love it. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know all of you and doing this research with all of you. Ooh. So here's my mini Gretna girl on the side. This was designed by Rhiannon, who is a lot better at art than I am, and she works at the Devil's Porridge Museum as well. I just think they look so cute. So this session is designed to equip you with all of the tools that you're going to need to conduct online remote research about the people who worked at HM Factory Gretna. And I know that many of you are really experienced researchers and know your way around Ancestry and Find My Past like the back of your hand, but I also know that some of you are complete newcomers to online historical research. So I'm going to start with the basics. And I always think, I actually attended a session a couple of months ago about oral history research methods, and I just think sometimes a refresher is just lovely. It just sort of brings you back into that mode of like you get back down to what the core purpose of historical research is. So feel free to ask me any questions as we go along and share your own research tips and tricks if you have any. So to reduce the background noise and to make sure that everybody can hear me, could you all please place your microphone on mute unless you have a question? But saying that, if you have a question or a tip or trick, just unmute your microphone and feel free to share. So, historical research tries to find out more about the past. So historians want to figure out why an important historical person did what they did, or maybe the cultural rules or surroundings that dictated a particular society, or anything that builds up our understanding of a particular historical period. And normally pre-COVID, a lot of this finding out was done in person in places like archives, museums and libraries, places that hold historical artifacts and also hold documents and photos and all of that fun stuff. However, in recent years, lots of historical data has been digitized and put online, which is so great, especially when you're researching things that maybe are in archives all over the world. It just makes things a lot easier to be able to go to a website rather than having to take a plane ride and do a massive research trip. So yeah, this is amazing. It means you can do research from anywhere in the world. And obviously when archives reopen, we'd love, if you guys are willing and able, for you to visit and see any local archives near to you, see if they can uncover anything related to HM Factory Gretna or the research. But for the moment, we're all going to be using online tools to research. And actually, because the last year of my PhD was all online historical research tools, so it's kind of become almost the norm for historians and researchers in that last year not to be visiting archives. So the sources that researchers gather tell them about an era they're researching and are generally categorized as either primary or secondary sources. And primary sources are sources that were created during the time period you're researching. So can anybody give me an example of a primary source? You can unmute or you can write in the chat box. Oh, 2 people have entered the room. I'll just admit them. There we go.
Or as somebody who's actually been there when the event happened, the primary source.
Yes, definitely. Oral history is such a great sort of way to gather primary source material. A census, Beth has said, and a newspaper from Kathy. Yeah, both really great.
Logbooks.
Yeah, logbooks. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would anything, any kind of material. I really like things like letters. I think they're great primary source material.
Or diaries.
Diaries, yes, definitely. So yeah, you can sort of tell from those answers that there are such a large range of things that can be considered primary source material. It's not just kind of official government papers. It's things like diaries, letters, logbooks, anything that dates from a particular era. So this is an example of a primary source that is actually held by Factory Gretna. They're pictures from the Moss Band Farewell, which is a magazine put together by factory workers at the end of the war in the Moss Band section of Factory Gretna. And this is a really great example of a primary source, because not only does it contain things like poems written by workers, pictures of operating staff. There you can see the whole kind of group photo, and things and writings from chief supervisors and all of that. It sort of gives us a picture of the people who were working there. And what I'm going to do is post a link to the full copy of this Moss Band Farewell magazine. I'm going to email you all after and send you that link so you can have a look through that at your leisure. It's a really interesting historical research, and I've spent a lot of time reading it and peering at it up since joining the Devil's Porridge Museum. So as you can see from just a few pages of this document, we have signatures, we have photos of staff, we have written almost kind of letters to the magazine, and it also, importantly for this research in particular, has a list of names and addresses near the end of the magazine, which is such a valuable research document because it makes those people so much more easy to find if you know their address post-war. And it just gives us a bit of a glimpse into the culture. There's things like jokes and bedtime stories for chemists in there, which is really lovely. So, tools for finding primary sources. So, as I said previously, many primary sources are held in things like museums, archives, or libraries. But much of the work on this particular project will be using these online tools. So, Ancestry, Scotland's People, and the British Newspaper Archive. So for Ancestry, I'm sure most of you guys have heard of Ancestry. It has so many records, things like census, birth, marriage and death registers, military records, and it's a really great resource, like general resource, so you can just kind of see if you can build up a picture of that person's life through mainly official documents. Scotland's People is a website for researching governmental records and archives for people in Scotland. And it also has birth, marriage and death data, as well as some church and legal documents. So yeah, it's really, really helpful. It's just hard sometimes in the research I've done so far is that somebody's entered the waiting room. The research that I've done so far is that I get really excited, think that I can go on Scotland's People, and then I remember that the person I'm researching maybe wasn't from Scotland and might not show up on Scotland's People. And then the third tool that I mainly use for finding primary sources online is the British Newspaper Archive, which is a digitised resource of national and local newspapers from the UK that is searchable by keyword, date and location. So in the Google Drive folder, which you'll have access to, so I'm going to email this to you after the session ends, you'll also have access to primary sources from our museum collection. So we've got things like the Moss Band Farewell, we've also got the Dornoch Farewell, which was the other factory site, and they also wrote a magazine, and we've also got things like autograph books, archive photos, so I put all that on the Google Drive folder. So you've got access to those as well as these kind of outside museum tools. So you'll have lots of places to find relevant primary sources for your research. So alongside primary sources are secondary sources. So can anybody name me some examples of secondary sources? Ooh. Let me have a look at the chat. Yeah, books written about the subject. Definitely. That's almost, I think, the first secondary source we think of, especially when it comes to history, is that you just turn to a nice comprehensive book that's hopefully written on your subject.
Research papers.
Yeah, research papers, journal articles are also really great sort of in-depth looks at certain subjects. Kathy's put websites on the chat. That's, yeah, I love websites and blogs. There are so many great historical focused blogs out there that contain really great information. TV and radio programs, Maddie said, yes, definitely. Documentaries and they can be just audio or for TV, are really great. I think I always categorize documentaries, historical documentaries, as kind of like that access point where you first learn about a subject and you get really into it and start reading books and journal articles on it afterwards. But yeah, they're really, really great and contain some often great information, but also in many documentaries, they go to museums and actually look at artifacts and documents. So yes, those are all really great examples of historical sources. Oh, sorry, what was that?
Oh, sorry. Would you include fictional and drama?
Oh, see, I think in some ways that those kind of sources and resources can give us important information, but I think because of that fictional aspect of it, we can't sort of take it entirely as a secondary source. If that
It
makes
might give you might give you a lead to follow.
definitely. And a lot of historical programs these days generally have historical consultants on who have written books on the subject. Ripper Street, which I need to watch, it's been on my list for a billion years, had Fern Riddell as their historical consultant, who has written quite extensively on suffrage and the Victorian era musicals. We've also had lectures from people. I've attended so many webinars recently that are so great. Recollections of stories from living relatives. Yes, and actually that's another resource that we have at the museum. We have a Memories of Gretna Girls folder in the Google Drive folder that I will send to you all, and that has things that people have munitions workers have told their relatives, which is such a great kind of family like hand-me-down. Memorabilia or family stories, yeah, that's definitely right. And yes, oral archive from the Imperial War Museum. I am so looking forward to. I know there's a from the University of Leeds, the Liddell collection has some interviews with munitions workers from Gretna, which I'm very, very keen to hear because I think they'll be fascinating. But yes, those are all really great examples of secondary sources. Let's see if I can, there we go. So this is a couple of examples of secondary sources. So first up is Gretna's Secret War by Gordon Routledge, and this was the first book I read when I started. I read this on my very first day at work because it's almost the kind of the entry point, the first book written all about HM Factory Gretna and Gretna's role in World War One. And this is also in your Google Drive folder. I scanned it and took photos of it and uploaded it. So if you want to have a read through of Gordon's book, it's up there. Timber Town Girls by Chris Brader really looks at the way in which Borders women sort of entered an identity, or like created their identity during the First World War, and that is also focused a lot on HM Factory Gretna. But it also looks at things like cinema and how munitions workers interacted with the cinema and football and sort of the recreation things. So it's really, really good. And then I've also got a journal article example here about reappraising the Ministry of Munitions, which obviously was the governmental department which sort of controlled HM Factory Gretna and all the other munitions factories. So I just want to do a quick sort of brief note about secondary sources. So if you're researching people, names that we give you, secondary sources might be secondary to your research. You might gather all the information on your particular person from Ancestry, British newspaper articles, or Scotland's People, and then have a look through books like Gretna's Secret War or journal articles to see if they're mentioned in the secondary literature. However, if you're researching a particular theme, and I know that some of you have sort of, when you emailed me, said that you're really interested in like medical provisions or another aspect of World War I history, you might say start with books on medical provisions at munitions factory during World War I to get an idea of the historical context before maybe moving on to primary sources. So it all depends on your research and what you want to research, and also your preferences as a researcher. I tend to start with primary sources and then go on to secondary sources, but I do know that other people do it completely the opposite. Some people have a mix between the two approaches. So yes, let's have a look. So tools for finding secondary sources. So in addition to the secondary sources uploaded in the Google Drive folder, which you will have access to after this session, these tools are a really great way to find secondary sources. So Google Books I love because you can just type in a keyword or a person's name and see if any books mention that person or that area of research that you're actually researching. Journal articles are another way to kind of find secondary sources, another secondary source, and they're generally written by academics and they're often behind a paywall. But if you find one that looks really good that you can't access, just email it over to me and I'll see if I can access it. I've also added in the secondary sources folder of the Google Drive some journal articles just to kind of give you a flavour of the history around Gretna and also what's been written about it. Documentaries. So YouTube is a great source for historical documentaries, and there is actually a short 10-minute one done by History Hit on the Devil's Porridge Museum, and also websites and blogs. So a quick Google search might reveal that someone has done previous research on the person that you're researching, and that's always a great way to kind of find out more information, to see what sources they've used, and see how you're going to approach it differently. So we want this research project to be flexible. We want you all to research what you're passionate about. So many of you have sort of said that you are interested in particular themes of history, or you've maybe done previous work or research into particular areas. And others want to find out more about particular people, like maybe their relatives, or they just want to find out more about the actual people who worked at HM Factory Gretna. And for some, it may be a combination of both approaches. So you may be really interested in how HM Factory Gretna set up their medical provisions. So you might be interested in a particular doctor, and then that might lead you on to more interest in more research in medical provisions more generally. So if you're interested in people, we're going to assign you a name and give you all the information we have on that person in the museum. And then you'll be able to use the primary sources and the secondary sources on the Google Drive folder, as well as the online tools that you'll have access to research. So we're going to do a case study today. So I want you all to imagine that you've been given this name, Maud Bruce, and that she was born in 1895. And this was actually the research task I was given when I was interviewing for my job at the Devil's Porridge Museum. So this is kind of a bit of what I did to find out more about Maud and how I went about that. So the first thing that I did when I received this research task was to Google Maud Bruce, because I thought, it's not going to hurt if I just do a quick kind of Google. Is she really famous, and have I completely missed her in my kind of historical research thus far? And as you can see, this didn't turn out too well, and that's generally what happens, I think, in my experience, when you just do a Google of somebody's name. Most of the results were on the daughter of Robert Bruce, which is in a completely different time period to the time period we're researching. And this is a really great example of just how off the mark a Google search can be with just a name. You can potentially get thousands of results on a person that isn't even the person that you're looking for. So I then decided to narrow it down a bit. I typed in Maud Bruce Gretna, because I knew she was connected with Gretna in some way, and I thought that might help. So this would also work if I'd put in HM Factory Gretna or things like munitions, just key relevant terms. And as you can see, this immediately came up with results that I could be pretty sure related to the Maud Bruce I was looking for. So you can see here the Devil's Porridge website comes up twice, and a blog on inspirational women of World War One. Somebody's entered the waiting room, I'll admit them. So because of that, I thought, I think I'm on the right track here. And here are a couple of screenshots of those websites. So clicking on these results gave me an idea of who Maud Bruce was. The blog post mentions that she was a forewoman at Gretna and won a medal for bravery. And the post on the Devil's Porridge Museum website even has, if you can see down here, a grainy black and white photo of Maud, which looks to have come from a newspaper article. So this gave me a bit of a pointer of maybe where I should go with my research. So after visiting these sites, I went to the British newspaper article, and the image on the left here is the front page of the British newspaper archive. And as you can see, like with Google, there's a simple search bar, but underneath the bar, you can see that you can also browse by date, country, region, place, county even. And this is really helpful for our research project. So we can limit searches to a particular time period, so like 1914 to 1918, to a particular place, even to a particular newspaper, which is really helpful, I find, when you know that a particular newspaper has an article that you need to find. You can just narrow it down to that particular newspaper. And as you can see from the image on the right, I did a simple search, exactly the same to my Google search of just putting in Maud Bruce. And in the same way, the initial search results were a bit off the mark. As you can see, we've got an article here from 1889, Miss Maud Bruce, and then an article about Lady Ellen Maud Bruce from 1924. So the first result dates from 6 years before our Maud's birth, which we know from the information we were given. And the second search is of a person called Lady Ellen Maud Bruce, who is 75 in 1924, which also doesn't look likely to be the Maud Bruce that we're searching for. And I also just wanted to note that you can see that on the image on the right, ways to refine your search, so you could narrow it down by date and the newspaper, etc. So I did just that. I put in some search filters. So I had filters from 1900 to 1949, as I thought that would be a good bet when our Maud was active. And I also put in Scotland, because I thought maybe that would, because I knew she was connected with Gretna, that might help. So, I always do this. So even though the first results are the same as my previous search, and it probably doesn't relate to the Maud I was searching for, so I decided again to do my old faithful of adding the word Gretna to the search. And that came up with even though with some results, the first result was still that of Lady Ellen Maud Bruce. But when I scrolled down, I saw two results that looked like they could be the Maud Bruce we were searching for. So the first mentioned services of special merit in connection with the war, which seems likely because as we've looked at the Devil's Porridge Museum website, I'd already known that the Maud I was looking for had been awarded certain honours. And the second was even better because the headline, as you can see, is Heroism at Gretna, which makes me think this is bang on the money. This is the person that I'm looking for. So I clicked on the first article, and this is the thing that you'll see when you go on the British newspaper archives. You'll see it will sort of zoom in on the article that your search term had highlighted, and you can zoom in even further and move this page around using your mouse just to kind of read everything a bit more clearer. So this first article gave me a lot of really great information about the Maud Bruce I was looking for. It said that she was one of the recipients of the New Order of the British Empire, and it also tells us where she lived, Grenville Hostel in Eastriggs. And it says that she came from Bishop Auckland in Durham. And this is kind of biographical information is really, really helpful when it comes to tracking down census and other official records on websites like Ancestry. So I wrote out here a sort of selection of the article on Maud Bruce, and as you can see, that photo there is the same photo that was used on the Devil's Porridge Museum website of Maud looking resplendent in her Gretna Gael outfit, and it details her heroic deeds at Gretna. So she put out fires, quite literally, and because of this she was awarded an honour, a medal. So this was a really great find. I was very, very excited when I found this, because not only had I managed to trace that photo which I'd seen on the Devil's Porridge Museum website, I'd also found out more information about what Maud did at Gretna, why she was awarded these honours, and a bit of information about where she lived at the time and where she came from. So these are just a few other ways to narrow down search results on the British newspaper archives which I use. So things like using the search filters, which I mentioned before, are really, really great. You can narrow down dates, countries, regions. So here I've narrowed down the date from between 1900 to 1949. I've narrowed the country to Scotland, and I've narrowed the county down. You can also do things like use quotation marks, and what this does is search for key terms together. So instead of searching for Maud and Bruce and Gretna, by putting quotation marks around Maud Bruce, it will search for Maud Bruce and Gretna, and that just makes search results a bit more accurate. I also, if you look in the image on the right, I did a lot of searches, as you can see, using different sort of Gretna OBE, because I knew she was awarded an OBE, and I also found out her middle name, so I tried searching with that. Maud Ellen Nunn was her married name, so I tried searching with that. And you could also do things like different spellings of Maud, so Maud with an E, that kind of thing. So yeah, there are loads of ways to narrow down search results on British newspaper archives. So after searching on the British newspaper archives and finding out a little bit more about Maud, I then headed over to Ancestry. Now, I always start by looking at public member trees because it's almost kind of like the lazy way to find out as much information as fast as possible. And public member trees are basically public family trees compiled by other Ancestry members. So if the person you're trying to research has had family members who are also into family history who's already done that research, there's a good chance they've already got a tree on Ancestry. And this then cuts down your research time because public family member trees often have sources compiled that you can use. So if you go onto the Ancestry website, you sort of highlight the search bar, you can just scroll down and click on the public member trees, and you will come up with this thing to fill in, search bar to fill in. So I just put in the information that I definitely knew about Maud, so her first and last name and the year of her birth. And like with both Google and the British Newspaper Archives, it came up with results that I knew probably weren't going to be our Maud that we were looking for. So Ida Maud Bruce was born, although she was born in the correct year, this was in Canada, and she also died in 1902, so far before HM Factory Gretna and World War One. However, I scroll down a bit, I hit this result. So not only did the OBE give me a clue that this might be the Maud I'm after, but also the date of birth, 20th of December 1984. So we're a little bit out, but it's near enough. And her place of birth was in Durham, which the newspaper article had said she was from. So I was a bit kind of like, oh, this might be the person I'm looking for. So I clicked on this page, and as you can see, there's lots of biographical information, facts about Maud's life, and lots of sources. We've got things like census data, the 1901 census and the 1911 census. We've got the 1939 register and birth, marriage and death information. And now is a quick time to say something about making sure you found the right person you're looking for, which is tricky, and often sometimes you're so invested in this research that you really want this person to be the person you're looking for, but things don't quite add up. As you've seen from both Ancestry and the British Newspaper Archives, there are a lot of Maud Bruces throughout history, and things get even more tricky when, say, you're looking for a John Smith or Jack Jones or something like that. There are just lots of these people with the same names throughout history. I like to approach research by thinking of myself as a kind of historical detective. So I'm looking for evidence that either supports or disproves my hypothesis that this is indeed the right person. And I always keep an open mind about when assessing whether or not I've hit the right person. So although this at the moment adds up in terms of being the Maud Bruce that I'm looking for, I'm always a bit kind of skeptical, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So these are some photos of the sources that Ancestry gave me on Maud Bruce. Lots of lovely information about her background and her family and her life after Gretna. So it looks like from the 1901 census that her father was a coal miner, and by 1939 Maud was living with her husband Thomas and performing unpaid domestic duties. However, there will always be people who haven't got interested researchers or relatives and who don't have public member trees on Ancestry. And in those cases, you can click on this tab here, which says Search All Records. And again, this is just kind of the same thing that I did with the public member trees. I put in Maud's first name, last name, and her birth year. And again, it came up with 98,000 results. So there's a lot of results to go for. And this is where your kind of historical detecting comes into play. You're assessing whether each result is likely to be Maud or not based on the information you already know. And I just kind of simply went through all these, clicked on them, put some in my maybe pile, ruled some out, and built up a picture of Maud's life based on that. So, sorry, I will stop talking soon. You're probably all fed up of hearing my voice. And as you can see, I haven't talked to anybody for this long, for this amount of time, such a long time. My voice is going already. So although I didn't use the website Scotland's People in my search for Maud, And this was simply because I knew she wasn't Scottish, and it seemed likely that the only extended time she spent in Scotland was during the war. This website can be really helpful in finding Scottish people connected with Gretna, and also babies, marriages, and deaths for people who worked at Gretna, because they have all of those kind of parish records. So this website works similarly, oh goodness, I can't speak, Monday, to Ancestry, in that you can search a name and various categories pop up. So things like births, deaths, marriages, censuses, church registers, and legal records. And then you can narrow down these sources by clicking on them. And you might have actually noticed throughout our case study of Maud that I focused on primary source research into people as opposed to themes. However, if you're interested in thematic research, you might focus more on secondary sources to begin with. So when I researched Maud, I found out on the Devil's Porridge Museum website that she was said to have been one of the first people in Britain to receive plastic surgery, which is an incredible sort of milestone, and also suggests, this is hard because it's that whole the gaps between what I know and what I am sort of hypothesizing. But what I know is that Maud put out a lot of fires at Factory Gretna while she was there, and that was what she was awarded her honours for. So could she been injured in some of those fires, and that's why she had plastic surgery and became one of the first people to have plastic surgery in the country? I don't know. That's something that I still want to find out. But I was actually unable to double check this or find any evidence in the primary source material that I found to verify this. And this information had actually come from oral history testimony given to the museum. And it's always best to kind of verify that kind of information. So when I got the job, I'd found out a lot of information about Maud Bruce, which was great. But Judith, who is the museum manager, was a bit disappointed that I hadn't been able to track down whether or not she had received this plastic surgery and who she'd received it from and what plastic surgery she'd received. So thinking about what more I could have done or could do in future would be things maybe reaching out to reading secondary sources about plastic surgery and the origins of plastic surgery in the UK, seeing if there are any archival sources that from doctors who maybe performed plastic surgery during or just after World War I. So that kind of demonstrates that there is this kind of link between people research and thematic research. And although I find Maud Bruce very, very interesting, I am very, very keen to discover whether or not she did indeed receive this plastic surgery, and where she received this and what she received, and so on. So if you can't find very much out about the individual, secondary sources on subjects connected with them might help and might actually even be the basis of your research if you're interested in themes like medical provisions or the state management scheme. So for an example, Judith, the museum manager, did an exhibition on people from the Commonwealth, and she researched Kenneth Bingham Quinnan, who was a really big figure in the factory, and the places he'd worked and the organisations he was part of before and after working at Factory Gretna. And secondary source articles on him helped to understand that historical context in which he'd worked. And then this then led on to a lot more information about other people he'd worked with. I always find when I was doing my PhD that I'd almost mine journal articles and books for their sources. So if I was reading a book and it said Maud Bruce was one of the first people in the UK to receive plastic surgery, and they had a reference, I'd then go to that reference, and if it was an archival source or another book that had said this, and I'd find out where they've got that information from. And that's often a really good way of kind of finding out sources of information and more sources of information. So I'm going to sort of set you a bit of a research task. It's time for you to have a go. So I'm going to ask you how much you can find out about Kenneth Bingham Quinan, born 1878, in 10 minutes. And I'm going to split you up. So some of you are going to research Kenneth Bingham Quinan using items from the collections. Others will Google, use Ancestry, British newspaper archives, etc. And you can share what you find in the group chat. And I don't want you to worry if you can't find very much, because 10 minutes is a really short amount of time, and it takes a long, like, research is a long process sometimes. Maddie said in the chat that there's a really interesting article on the chemical engineer. The chemical engineer is actually one of those resources that comes up time and time again when you're looking into people from Gretna, because obviously so many of them were chemists. So yeah, well done for finding that. We've got about 5 minutes left, guys, and just another reminder, don't worry if you can't find very much. It's a big old task researching. So yeah, you're doing really well. Oh, Kathy's put that there's lots on Wikipedia. Kenneth Bingham Quinan, usually known as KB Quinan, or KBQ in a lot of the primary source material, was an American-born chemical engineer who settled in South Africa and contributed significantly to the British war effort in World War I by designing and building efficient explosive factories, but no mention of Gretna. That's a really good insight actually there, Kathy, and that's something that we really want to address in this research project, is making those links. And another thing that's come up, just like with the article Maddie found, was this settling in South Africa, and chemical engineers and chemists and engineers settling in South Africa before and after the war, which comes up time and time and again. There were a lot of people who came from South Africa to specifically work at Gretna and then settled back there after the war. So that's another really great theme that I think could be uncovered more in this research project. Ah, brilliant. Kathy's found a link to the Devil's Porridge website, which does have a couple of blog posts, I think, we have on Kenneth Bingham Quinan, the great KBQ, which was his nickname at the factory. So again, that's another kind of example that websites and blogs, yeah, his wiki article could definitely be improved, which is, yeah, very cool project, Maddie. It's one of those ones that you just want to... According to Wikipedia, he had no formal qualifications, which again is a really interesting kind of insight into his life and his career. Rona's found some instances. National Archives have plans of machinery and the plant at Gretna. Yeah, and that's another thing that I think would be really interesting in this research project, is trying to see where all the archival material is about Gretna, and see whether we can uncover some. Interesting to see that the paper said when he turned down a knighthood. Ah, I didn't know that. So that's really interesting. Well done, Pat. His picture, yep. I actually did one of those a couple of weeks ago. Did you know the New Horizons or My Heritage have done that thing where they can animate old photos, and I did one for him, and it was very cool and also equally eerie. Oh, Chelsea's found some really interesting stuff on Ancestry. Departed in Durban, South Africa, and tipped the ship Britain, which was operated by the Union Castle Mail Steamship Company. He arrived in Southampton in January 1922. Yes, that's another thing that I've noticed about Ancestry since starting at the Devil's Porridge Museums. They've got lots of records of the shipping and incoming passenger lists, which is also really interesting, because on those lists they have things like the address of that person, their occupation, which just gives you more information about them. Well done, Chelsea. Right, guys. I think we're going to stop with the research there. Well done, you found some amazing things, and I know it's a big old task sort of sending you off to look at all this new information on websites. Oh, Rhoda's found something. Began working for his uncle in an explosive factory in California. Yes, well done. It's that whole, you can trace the kind of connections with explosives all the way through KBQ's life. So yeah, well, that's a great information to find. But well done for going on doing 10 minutes of research. That was just kind of a bit of an exercise to stretch all your research muscles. So, what's next? So today we've learned all about primary and secondary sources and how to use online tools to find these sources, and also the primary and secondary sources that you'll have access to as a volunteer on this research project. And we've also done a little bit of a research practice. So after this session ends, I'm going to email you all a link to our Google Drive folder. And in this folder, you'll be able to see some of the museum's digitised collections of primary source material and some secondary source material that will really help you understand the historical context of Gretna. And that should really help in your research. And if you have enough time, and I really recommend just having a brief read through of all of these, both primary and secondary sources, because not only are they really, really interesting, but they just give you that just give you more of an idea of Gretna and everything that was happening at that time. And today we have covered loads about historical research. I'm sure you're all sick of the sound of my voice now, but we haven't actually covered what we're going to do with that research. So we're going to do another kind of week of training sessions on turning research into content. And this will be the same as this week's training sessions, in that I'm going to give you times and days. And if you can't make any of them or you're busy, don't worry, we're going to do the same thing and record our training sessions so that you can then watch them at your leisure. So the dates for these training sessions, and don't worry if you miss these, I will mention them in the emails and send you out a doodle poll, will be Tuesday the 6th of April, 2 to 3 p.m, Wednesday the 7th of April, 7 to 8 p.m, and Thursday the 8th of April, 7 to 8 p.m. So don't worry if you can't make any of them. They will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and this is just going to sort of tell you how you can transform all that raw data that you found during your research into something that can be turned into a Wikipedia article or a blog post, or put on our database of people who worked at Gretna. And so in between these two sessions, I'm going to give you a task to do. And again, this is only if you've got enough time. Don't worry if you forget about it or don't quite get to it. And this is just to make sure you're all really comfortable using the online tools like Ancestry and the folder of information and primary source material on our Google Drive. So these are 3 names that are people connected with HM Factory Gretna that I want you to research. I'll leave this screen up for a bit if you want to write them down, but I also will put them in the email as well, because otherwise I know what I'm like with forgetting names. So yes, I'll leave this screen up for a little bit. And yeah, this is just to help you feel a bit more comfortable and to do a little bit, just do some research without any pressure. Just have a look into them and see what you can find out. Use those historical detecting skills, as I like to say. So if you've got any questions or queries, feel free to contact me via email or write a post in the Facebook group. And yeah, the next sessions, turning research into content, are on the week beginning the 5th of April, and those will also be uploaded to YouTube. But it's been absolutely lovely meeting you all and putting faces to email addresses today. So yes, lovely seeing you all. And if you have any questions before you go, I will check the chat. Yeah, thank you so much for coming today, and I hope you've enjoyed it and I haven't bored you all to death on a Monday morning. And I will see you at the training sessions next week, or I will speak to you via email.